and welcome to this Vassals of Kingsgrave edition to talk about all things Jack the Ripper, slightly coincidental with the anniversary of his gruesome Whitechapel murders. And I just want to say, because I've been immersing myself a little bit in the culture over the last couple of weeks, we do this with nothing prurient and with nothing but deep respect and sympathy for the victims, which I think sometimes gets overlooked as they become sort of crawled over as clues in a gripping multi-century case. But with that, we have a diminished group of podcasters today. My name's Bina007 on the forums. I am joined by...
No True Lady on the forums, also known as Julia. This is my grand return to the podcast. Yeah, I've been away most of the year working on my own projects. But yeah, I went back to the forums the other week and saw this topic, and I was like, yes, I would like to do that, because I have been fascinated by the Jack the Ripper case for many, many years.
But how did you get into the whole Ripper thing?
Well, when I was a kid, I was into like a lot of like darker, weird stuff anyway, like Loch Ness Monster, the sinking of the Titanic, Bigfoot. Anything that had to do with sort of the bizarre, the occult was definitely my thing. Okay. And I think that eventually you just find Jack the Ripper. If you put it in like the bag of like dark, weird, catch-all cultural touchstones, you're going to come across Jack the Ripper before too long.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things we need to explore, is why does it have that hold upon us? It's insane. And so when you got into it, like, was it through sort of the Alan Moore from Hell, or was it just reading the case notes online, or sort of what is your cultural entry point to it?
I think it was just hearing about it and in sort of like the hushed tones of, you know, who was Jack the Ripper? And it's like, well, who was this guy? Did he kill dozens of people? And you know what? It's honestly, as I have read more, I've read a couple books preparing for this podcast and just gone over a few websites. I honestly think it's up to grabs about how many victims there were. But the way he's presented in culture is he's almost alongside with, you know, classic monsters like the vampire, like the werewolf.
Absolutely.
And yeah.
And I think that's the much more interesting part about the story, is actually, you know, just going through the canonical victims and going through the suspects, of which actually not so much is known, is far less interesting than how it's been refracted through history. And
yeah,
you know.
So I think, yeah, the main way I entered it was just sort of like retellings of the story, not from Hell. I actually didn't hear about the comic book graphic novel From Hell until the movie came out about 10 or so years ago, which I never saw. I never saw.
Well, you shouldn't. I had such high hopes. Because I had Robbie Coltrane as Abeline. As Abeline? I can't remember. But it just looked like it was going to be so good. And we know that Johnny Depp is an aficionado for all things weird and creepy. And it was horrible. Really horrible. So my route into Jack the Ripper is, I'm a bit of a conspiracy nut, although my conspiracy of choice has always been who shot JFK. Although, interestingly, I've come full circle on that, because I just read the Vincent Bugliosi, like, massive tome, so I think it was just a lone shooter, but that's another conversation. So I came to Jack the Ripper quite late, which is when I moved to London after university, and I actually lived in the area in which the killings happened, which made it a lot more alive to me. And what always struck me was that even now, sort of over 100 years later, that borderline between the city and Whitechapel, so what's within and without the city of London, is very porous. And one of the murders, which happens in Mitre Square, is now sort of the heart of the financial district, this very glossy, very sort of massively policed area, actually. And yet it butts right up to these old twisted streets that are very much like they used to be. And so that, I love all things historical in London, so that's what got me into it. And then I read From Hell, and I kind of thought that was, I thought that's how it was, that's how it happened, which was kind of naive of me. So then I had to go away and read some actual history and realize that the reality is probably far less sensational than all of that.
I was just going to say that it's kind of unfortunate that the prevailing theory, maybe not the prevailing theory, but the most popularized one is the royal conspiracy theory because of From Hell. And probably a lot of people do think that's what happened, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it was hilarious. I was out for lunch with some people from work, and I said, I'm going to do this podcast on the Ripper. And they said, oh my God, yeah, it's the royal scandal, isn't it? And, the Catholic wife of Prince Eddie getting knocked up. And then I was just like, oh my goodness, like these are really intelligent people, and they genuinely think this is what happened, which is quite disturbing. But there we go. It says something maybe for the everlasting British fascination with the royal family and our willingness to believe almost anything of it.
Oh yeah, and really, like if it's something bad about the royals, people will believe it.
Absolutely. So let us take ourselves back in time to Whitechapel, 1870s Whitechapel, which, for people who don't know, it's very central to the financial district in the old government heart of London. So the Tower of London is but a 2-minute walk from this district, as was then and now the Stock Exchange. But it is on the east side of London, and it's always been a place for waves of immigrants to come in, often political refugees. And at the time of the murder, and I really want to discuss the context of it, really a place of deep poverty and social, I wanted to say social neglect, but it wasn't actually, because this is a time when people started to get really worried about it. You've got the British Empire at the height of its wealth and glory. At this point, Britain rules, most of the world ex the US. Boo. And at the
whatever.
At the height of its pride and hubris, I think. And suddenly it became annoying that, my God, there's this all too visible patch of London that's full of prostitutes and drinking and poverty, and it's starting to worry us. So
yeah, apparently Whitechapel during this time was like one of the worst slums in the world.
Yeah,
it was really truly horrific. I mean, I said Dickensian hellscape, even though it's a little bit past that time of Dickens. But I mean, like, if you can imagine everything you've seen in Oliver Twist or anything like that, and just like that's what it was like.
But I think that's really, I think it's opposite actually, because if you think of Dickens and you think of, I don't know, Bleak House and Poor Joe, the crossing sweeper in the fog of Holborn, that's just a 10-minute walk from the Commercial Street area and the Tun Bells. If you think of, I'm rereading Our Mutual Friend at the moment, and his description of the river and the fog off the river and the murdered bodies and that atmosphere of London stroke East End, it's bang on. And I think, out of Dickens comes the new journalism, W.T. Stead, and comes this sort of wave of people, earnest young liberal people who are trying to publicise what's going on. And what always fascinates me is how there was some slum clearance, ironically, to create what's now Commercial Street, which is the big thoroughfare through Whitechapel. And that just made it even worse because there was less housing and it just became more overcrowded. So, no good deed goes unpunished, I guess. But a really horrific part of London.
Yeah, and to magnify the issues, at the time, I'm not even going to say at the time. I think still a lot of people have this attitude towards poverty. It's definitely the prevailing attitude was these people they just weren't with it morally. That they just needed someone to give them a firm shake about the shoulders and give them something productive to do, and that these women who were prostitutes, it was their choice. They somehow didn't know it was wrong, and they wallowed in their wantonness, and
exactly.
it was not at all out of sheer desperation and so there was a lot of victim blaming going on, and you're just like this because you choose to be. And
absolutely. I mean, this is the long strain in British political culture, starting off with the Poor Laws, and if you want to go back in literature, read Thomas Hardy, Far from the Madding Crowd, and poor Fanny Brown. If something happened to you in your life that was not really your fault but that was bad, you just ended up being categorized. Are you the deserving or the undeserving poor? And I guess the prevailing attitude would have been these people are undeserving. They're undeserving of help. They're wanton. And I kind of, and from a female perspective, that somehow these prostitutes are almost like nymphos or something. They enjoy their work, which I find particularly offensive. And one of the things I hated about From Hell, the movie, as opposed to the comic book or the graphic novel, I should say, in the graphic novel, it depicts the victims as they were, which is middle-aged,
Mm-hmm.
out of shape, bloated by alcohol, whereas in the film suddenly they become these voluptuous 20-something bodice ripping girls, you know. And I think it's really nasty the way that
Mm-hmm.
gets transformed. There's an air of complicity in it somehow.
Yeah. And the fact is that these were women who were the lowest of the low. The phrase for them at the time was unfortunates.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so if you think about prostitution as its own kind of, I don't even want to say career, but like it had its own sort of ladder. And at the top, you would have had women who were basically professional mistresses, the courtesans, who
Mm.
they, either had independent households or they were installed, in some wealthy man's home and were taken care of. They were kept women. And then you go down that ladder, and eventually you get to these women who had no money, were living day to day, and whatever money they did get a hold of, they basically drank.
Yeah, and what amazes me is
Because
when you read about
all
these victims, they earn the money for their night's shelter, then they have a drink, and then they have to go out and
Mhm.
earn it again. And you just think, my God, so the price of sex with these women was basically the price of a drink. I mean, it's
Mhm.
horrible. Sorry.
Yeah, and no, it is really horrible, and it's not fun to think about, and it just really magnifies the tragedy that these women were. There was just no way that they were going to get out of this existence. And I mean, I'm sure there are other murders that happened around this time in the general area that we'll never know about. That I mean, we'll get into the theories eventually, but I mean,
No.
this was an awful, dangerous life.
Absolutely,
Hmm.
and not uncommon. The fact that there
Hmm.
were only 5 canonical victims, sort of, this was a huge pervasive problem. And there's some statistic about the sheer number of prostitutes working in London at this time. Remember, at the time of heightened Protestant sort of morality, the Victorian society was, on the face of it, it's the triumph of the middle classes. It's incredibly moralistic, and yet prostitution's rampant, and so is the concept of people from the West End, the rich part of London, going to the East End as sort of voyeurs of poverty. But the only point I wanted to make, sort of in conclusion to this section, was to say that apart from one, the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, although became prostitutes, they started off maybe as married women, as having
Hmm.
husbands, as families, children, and then something usually happens, whether it's a child dying and they can't get over the grief, or the husband leaves them, and they fall by stages into this life. What alarms me about this compared to modern Britain is there's no safety net. You have one bad knock in life, and you end up going from being a farmer's wife in Wales to being a prostitute in the East End.
Yeah.
There was no support system for these women apart from their own camaraderie, for whatever that was worth. And that bears some thinking about, I think.
Yeah, it's a very common story. Almost all the victims, canonical and the other ones that are speculated about, they had a very similar stories. They were middle aged. They had all been married or had some sort of committed relationship in their past. They were all alcoholics.
Mm.
Many of them did have children. I mean, there were cases. Having read some of the case notes, a lot of them had their bodies identified by close family members, which is awful. And another consistency I noticed with some of the cases was these women were estranged from their families. So you had things like one of the fathers of the victims or the husband saying, "Well, I haven't seen them in like 3 years, but I'm pretty sure this is them." And it's like, why haven't you seen them in so long? And you just think about, yeah, no safety net, no, just like people. You want to talk about people falling through the cracks? I think it's a level of degradation and desperation and poverty that we really can't wrap our heads around today, even in the worst parts of the world. It's just
Yeah.
unbelievable.
And it's if any of you have ever been on one of the Ripple walks, which I would kind of urge you to do, because it really, I mean, the area has changed, but it still has, the topography is the same, these narrow winding streets. The east end of London is still quite grubby, and it gives you a sense of what they lived in. And you can imagine with that thick London smog, and that was an incredibly, very similar to this August in England actually. It was a record cold, wet summer in 1888. And that exacerbated the London smog because of the fires burning. And you can just imagine this pestilent smell. The East End was, London still had industry at that time, so it had factories belching out fumes. And you go through these streets on these Ripple walks, and Hanbury Street, when one of the murders happened, you see one of the flop houses where the prostitutes would have tried to spend the night. And you see the house, and it's this narrow, dank room, and they would have had a rope pulled from one side to the other, so if you didn't have enough money to get your space on the floor to sleep for the night, you could hang yourself over this rope and sleep sort of standing up, flopped over this rope. I mean, it's beyond barbaric. It really is. It's unbelievable. So I would encourage you all to do it. The only other thing I would say about Ripple walks, which I found really unpalatable, is you get to each one of these murder spots, of course, they hang around the pictures of the victims and the post-mortem pictures of them naked and sewn up, and I just thought, my God, this is like snuff photography, and it really makes you question your own, why you're doing it and your own interest in it. So yeah,
it is very gruesome, even though they're old photos, they're not color, these are things, they're out there, you can find them very easily.
They're on Wikipedia, right? I mean, they're not hidden at all, which in the wake of the recent sort of hacking iCloud sort of a debate that's going on right now, and you just think, well, what about the right to privacy of these poor women? I mean, unbelievable.
But that sort of brings us to a little bit what I think contributes to the longstanding fascination around Jack the Ripper. It's that it's the first serial killer case that has what we would recognize modern investigation and modern record keeping around it. And because of that, we can revisit it time and time again and try to find new things, new insights. And so I personally think that's why, because we have photos of the victims, we have there's lots of famous and infamous crimes where you can go to the spot, do haunted tours, that sort of thing, like the Jack the Ripper tours. But this really stands out as, here's the victim, here's all the various depositions and things like that, and it's so tangible,
Exactly. It's incredibly modern. I mean, it's 1888. We're now 2014, but you can grasp it. You really can, and that's, like I say, it's evident when you live in that part of London. I mean, I walk past White's Row practically every day. I mean, I went to the hairdresser and I was opposite the 10 Bells. I meet friends for drinks there after work, and it's very real. And I think what for me as London makes it real is that West East and Whitechapel being the dividing line of poverty to extreme riches. You have the banks right next door in these skyscrapers. It's still there. So as a Londoner then as now, are you willing to put up with this huge split in wealth? But anyway, maybe we should get to the victims kind of vaguely in order, I guess, because then that'll help us discuss a little bit about what we're doing here. So there is this sort of confusion over who was truly a Ripper victim. So most people think there are 5 canonical victims, and the canonical victims, I guess, are united by the fact that they were killed in vaguely the same way, the same kind of ripping, so the extreme mutilation of the female genital parts, the face, the manner, the speed in which the crimes were committed is what unites them. And then you have victims either side, and I think to your point about there are so many victims, this was a brutal era, that adds up to that, right? There are so many women who were killed in brutal circumstances, it's hard to know where the line is drawn. But the first one I wanted to talk about as an example of a non-canonical victim, but just symbolizing the brutality of the age, is Emma Elizabeth Smith, who was killed on Easter Monday, so April the 3rd, 1888. Which was a little bit north of Whitechapel and Shoreditch, but definitely walking distant. And I mean, I'm going to read it out. It's horrible. And I should say in this podcast, if you don't want to hear gruesome details, please tune out.
Oh, yeah. Trigger warnings all over the dang place.
Exactly. I'll put one at the front as well. I mean, because I am going to be pretty... So basically, Emma Elizabeth Smith, A blunt object ripped her vagina and she died later of peritonitis, saying 3 men attacked her. And what I think is crucial about this victim is I don't think she's a victim of the Ripper. Most people now think she's a victim of the old Nickel gang, who were a gang working in Shoreditch, so just north of Whitechapel, who ran prostitutes, among many other things. And one of the, if you watch From Hell, you can see that the prostitutes who were later killed in that were victims of the aggression of the old Nickel gang. And just what it, as if the degradation of being a prostitute enough, you have to deal with people fleecing you for part of your income. I mean, the brutality of this time. So it's an environment in which a Ripper could happen quite easily, and for it not to be immediately obvious, because just the background white noise of violence against women is so extreme.
I mean, I like to think that, this whole era was misogynistic in general. Well, I mean, it's not like, of course, culture still very much is, but like, it was just like so extreme.
Yeah.
It was just so over the top.
Exactly. But I guess the real victim that most people think is the first one is Martha Tabram. So she was killed on the 6th of August, 1888, so not long ago, the anniversary. And what I always find amazing about this is that Francis Hewitt and his wife were just 12 feet away when it happened. And bear in mind, I mean, she wasn't, I mean, we make it sound like it's better. She wasn't disemboweled or mutilated, but she had this huge cut in her stomach. So basically, basically from her genitals right the way up to her throat. This murder happened with people around. This wasn't, and in cramped circumstances. I'm always amazed, like, why didn't people hear? Why didn't people interrupt? Why was it, was the cry, was the scream of women or grunts of women so familiar a sound? Were people so gin-sozzled that this didn't register? That's what amazes me about this murder.
Yeah, that's the only theory I can come up with is, this was an incredibly, incredibly densely populated area. It was, like 10 people sleeping to a room, people, and also if you read the case notes, it's a very, very 24-hour nocturnal society. People were out on the streets every time, any time of day.
Yeah, absolutely.
At all times. And so there were people around. This, when we see sort of the dramatic reconstructions of the crimes, it's often like, a lone man walking through empty streets. No, like there were people around. And so I think probably it just speaks to, the sheer amount of people who were just in various states of inebriation at all times, and the sheer amount of violence and disorder.
Absolutely.
At all times.
And what I always find comical in From Hell is there's this big deal about how the killer probably had to paint a narcotic onto some grapes, which the prostitutes would have eaten because they would have been so glamorous they wouldn't have been able to resist to knock them out. And you think, my God, Martha Tabram, if you look at the pictures with this hugely bloated alcoholic woman whose first marriage has crumbled maybe because of her alcoholism. These are not women that needed to be silenced. They were barely together when they were killed. This idea that you had to have this elaborate sort of plot to kill these poor women is laughable, really. But yeah, so she was drinking in the Angel and Crown, which you can still drink in today. Your summary of London was hilarious. The pictures I put up. It's a pub and another pub. A woman got killed over there. Do you want a great curry?
Yeah.
But you can still go to that pub today and have a look at where she was having her last drink. But this murder was immediately thought of as being something new and amazing and specific. Do you find that surprising? Because she wasn't ripped in the classic sense, but they immediately decided she was a victim of this new thing, this new evil.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, and definitely the media played a big part in sensationalizing the story and creating parts of it, because most of the Ripper letters, which we will get to, are now considered to be not genuine, like that they were written by enterprising journalists. But immediately there was just something about this, the ferocity, the just sheer brutality of it, that made people, even in this very violent, area stand up and take notice.
Absolutely. So it's probably also worth mentioning, in relation to this particular murder, that this was picked up by the Whitechapel police. So another bizarre fact of London is that London is policed by the Metropolitan Police, but the City of London, which is the old walled city that was London in the time of the Tower of London and Henry VIII, has its own, it's the Corporation of the City of London, and it has its own police force. And so it's relevant to this case that the majority of murders were investigated by the Met, which is outside the walls, but one of the latter murders will happen within the walls. So H Division comes in, which is Whitechapel, still exists today, and they adjudicate that this is a brutal murder. But one of the people says that the victim was seen with a Grenadier card or a Coldstream guard, and that's where one of the red herrings, or one of the great myths of the murder, is that there was an army involvement, that a soldier did it. And so a lot of the initial investigation was about interviewing soldiers in the barracks. And as everyone knows, the Coldstream Guard barracks are right next to Buckingham Palace still today.
Yes.
So that, and almost from the start, this kind of like mythical connection to royalty and the very best of the West End is established, which I find quite interesting. But anything else to say about poor Martha Tabram?
Well, the circumstances, as you said, it was she and another prostitute had gone off with these two soldiers, and they went off to sort of like different sort of corners or alleys to, perform their work. And I just keep on thinking about how dirty everyone would have been, and like everyone would have been like sick with like something, like everyone would have always had some kind of like parasite or infection or something going on.
Absolutely. The level of disease would have been horrific.
Yeah, and everyone just would have been absolutely filthy. And then I'm thinking about people just having sex against walls and alleyways, and it's so awful.
Like, why are these even the circumstances that would be conducive to having sex? But so do you consider, because she's not one of the canonical 5 victims, so do you think she is a victim?
It's hard to say because, it was obviously a really, a brutal murder, but at the same time, it's like, who else would have had an opportunity to kill her other than this soldier who it seems like they try to prove that maybe this guy didn't even exist.
True.
Yeah, or that the men who were eventually fingered in the crime by, identified by the other prostitutes she was with had, solid alibis. So I guess, and we're talking about the speed with which these murders took place, where these women were, like butchered in not a very fancy fashion, but definitely it's something that would take time, and it just happened so fast. So she would have maybe, this soldier she would have been with and then wandered off and then immediately been picked off by someone else. I think it's just, and also the sheer amount of overkill that have been shown. She was stabbed some 39 times.
Yeah.
So that is what they call today in criminology overkill, where a victim is, and this is shown in a lot of the other Ripper murders. It's just the murderer goes far overboard in terms of what was needed to actually kill the victim.
And you see, this is what I find convincing. I mean, I know she's not canonical, but my argument would be that, what we know of serial killers is they don't come ready formed. They come into being, and they sort of practice and perfect and get to where they get the most satisfaction for what they're doing. So the idea of Martha Tabram not exhibiting all of the ripping, but yet being a sort of macabre neo-rip, or no, not neo, proto-rip, ripping case, to me makes a lot of sense. So I'm always, it's a shame FT Ward's not on, because he'd probably have some eloquent argument as to why she wasn't a victim. But
well, given the overkill aspect of it, I think that, if we're gonna, because this is something I personally debate a lot in my own head, was there at one serial killer at work? And so let's just say there was. I think that given that argument of a serial killer perfecting their method over time, that it makes sense that Martha Tabram would have been if not the first, because I mean, like it's unless you have the killer. I mean, like, and also serial killers are infamous in terms of just being just awful, awful liars.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
that I mean, like you, if they tell you this was my first victim, you can never trust them. So if she was not the first, she was definitely an early one.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay, so then we move on to poor Marianne or Polly Nichols, who was killed on the 31st of August, 1888. She was 43. And she was born, I think I always find this fascinating, she was born in a little street called Dean Street off Fetter Lane in London, which is in the city. And it's famous because it borders, or sort of on Fetter Lane now, is the massive Goldman Sachs International London headquarters. So how times have a change for that part of London. But yeah, so she was killed. She is thought of as being the first of the real canonical victims. She was also a prostitute. She was also someone who had been married, fallen into alcoholism. Her husband had left her. I think he'd had an affair with the nurse who attended the birth of her fifth child. So this is a mother of five. This isn't some sort of comely, sort of bodice ripped prostitute as we would see in the From Hell movie. And yeah, so she was killed basically in just off the Whitechapel Road in Bucks Row, which again you can see now. It's been slightly destroyed. It's now is this the one that's become the car park? No, this might not be. But
No,
it's the least recognizable of the scenes. I have seen this one, but there's not a great deal to see there. But yeah, she's again a sort of a slightly how to say, alcohol-riven, short 5'2" woman of middle age. Gruesome murder though. A 6 to 8 inch knife, multiple stab wounds, and the first of the real mutilations. And so this is the one that leads to the secondment of the famous Detective Inspectors Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews from the Central Office at Scotland Yard. So this is the moment at which Scotland Yard takes control of the case.
Yeah, not really sure what else to say about this. I mean, we have the mortuary photo. I mean, it's awful. It's just to know that these women, like most of the photos are just close-ups of their faces, and the wounds are actually like covered by sheets and whatnot. But like it's indisputably dead bodies, and you think about these women having been left in the street. It's just. Yeah, I think that's probably why these crimes so early on started to catch the attention of Scotland Yard and just the public in general, because okay, people were murdered, but they weren't murdered like this.
Absolutely.
There was something about, like, okay, as bad as things are in this district, they aren't this bad. Does that make sense?
Well, I think there's in the East End at the time you do have the casual violence which comes of drunken ruckuses and punishment beatings or enforcement beatings of prostitutes, a black eye to say pay up the money. But the sheer malevolence, the sheer pointless malevolence of this, like continually stabbing someone who's already dead, I mean that goes against the efficiency of the old Nickel gang, who again were fingered for this murder, it's worth saying. But to me, the thing that's interesting about this murder is, number one, it's when Scotland Yard is called in, but number two, this is when, and you have to remember at the time, the East End of London had a huge Jewish population, mostly who had come from Poland and what we now think of as Eastern Europe. And this is the murder where a mysterious local character called Leather Apron, aka John Pizer, a Polish Jew footwear maker, was rumored to be the killer. So that's where you start having the rumors, classic in case of violent crime, where people have to finger they have to put the blame at something, and what better than a hated immigrant group?
I'm sorry, go.
No, I mean I'm done. I'm out of steam.
Okay, I think this is something really important to point out. One of the books I read that actually blamed another Jewish immigrant, Aaron Kosminski. Because I mean, every Ripper book has their pet theory,
Absolutely.
and so I found it very hard. Excuse me. What I was trying to find was some kind of overview of the case that laid things out very sober, like well, it's all pretty sober stuff, but laid things out very objectively, and then ranked the suspects in terms of likeliness. But however, what people want is they want a definitive, this is the guy, and we can prove it, and we're never going to get that. I know.
Well,
So
I have a book on my Kindle which I will put a link to because my iPad's not to hand. Which is that? It's by one of, I think it might be Paul Chapman. It's one of the great reprisals where he just says these are the facts, and he lays the suspects out at the end. He kind of ranks them vaguely in order of what other people have thought, but he says, look, we're never going to know. Thinking that you're going to know is just drumming up book sales at the expense of reality. Here are the provable facts. But he also makes a fairly decent argument for Kosminski, which we can go over when we do the real suspects. But what I find interesting about John Pizer is the poor guy was arrested without any evidence. So Scotland Yard, basically called in and immediately acting beyond the bounds of the law immediately, which is, fantastic, and not with that president before or after, sadly. He had an alibi, which was confirmed, so he was let go. And he successfully sued some of the papers who had slandered his name. So I think that's, in a way, you could argue that it's justice and democracy in action, right? That ultimately the law works in a way. The evidence does clear him, and he does get compensation. But just I think the reason I bring this up here is because I do think Kosminski is one of the good arguments of someone who could have been the murderer, if you believe him, a murderer. And I think there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that Scotland Yard knew who it was, or knew who they thought it was a Jewish person, and therefore didn't release the information because they knew how inflammatory that would be, which, if right, is a rare example of race relations sensitivity from the London police force, and therefore should be commended. But just to show what a tinderbox this area was at the time, the fact that immediately, let's blame the Jewish guy, the Jewish immigrant, appalling, really.
Yeah, I think one important thing to bring up here in terms of the Jewish suspects is that in one of the books I read, that there had been this recent wave of immigration from Eastern Europe and Russia of Jews, because there had been a lot of anti-Semitic violence in the wake of the assassination of, was it Alexander II?
Oh, lacuna in my knowledge.
Okay, I'm gonna find this. Yes, it was Alexander II, and even though, again, Jews weren't involved in that, they got blamed. Well, okay, it was really messy, and then pogroms started, and just a lot of people left. A lot went to America, but a lot also ended up in England. And very quickly, these people had to make a living, obviously, and ended up doing a lot of garment industry work, and developed something called the sweating system, basically sweatshops. And then, of course, even though this was all needed and they were known for their actual high quality in terms of their work, they got blamed for taking the work away from the other people. And it's like, you can't have it both ways. A bunch of racist assholes.
It's true, but I mean, it's kind of interesting to me how Whitechapel has always had this. So, when the Huguenots were decided to leave under Protestant, or the Catholics' suppression of Protestantism, they ended up in Whitechapel, and they also brought over the lace trade from France, which put people out of business, and they got given shit. And then the Jews come over and they're given shit. And today, it's a huge area of Bangladeshi immigrant population, and they get given shit because obviously they're all members of Al-Qaeda cells, clearly. Of course. It's just sad how that thread just continues through. It really is.
Yeah, and so one of the big fears, going back to the theory that Scotland Yard knew, but didn't protect the suspect, but they didn't put it out there for fear of reprisals, is, the fear was that pogroms were going to happen in England. And,
Absolutely.
And if anyone doesn't know what a pogrom is, it's basically ethnic cleansing, but specifically the term is used against Jews in a Jewish community. It's when the Gentiles go in and ruin all the commerce and shops, burn people's houses, kill people, beat people up, women get raped, and just basically go in and just decimate the community.
Yeah.
Kristallnacht would have been a good example of a variation on a pogrom, which a lot of people see as the beginning of the really overt anti-Jewish campaign there under the Third Reich. So yeah, but moving on. That's part of the background of what was going on at the time, and it's important to note.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's also sort of plays in a little bit to the sort of weird attitude that I think we in England have towards our own history of anti-Semitism, which is kind of slightly superior. Well, we didn't give in to Hitler and we didn't do all that stuff. And even at this time, I think there's a lot of self-congratulation in England. Like we had a prime minister called Disraeli at the time, shortly before these murders. Along with Gladstone, one of the two great prime ministers of that century. And it's a very strange, uneasy acceptance of or acknowledgement of whatever was going down in that period. But yeah, the other thing to say before we move on from this poor victim is that she's one of the few whose grave you can visit if you want to do something that is commemorative rather than macabre. She's buried in the City of London Cemetery, which in classic British contradiction is not actually in the City of London but is out in Epping, but easily reached by the Central Line. So there's a very moving commemoration plate, and I would encourage any of you who are doing a Ripper tour to seek that out as well. Okay, and then so maybe on to Annie Chapman. So
Yes.
Annie Chapman was killed on Saturday, 8th of September 1888. So really, we're recording this on the 6th of September, but a Saturday, so it would have been the anniversary at 29 Hanbury Street. So really the address that a lot of people associate with the Ripper murders. And again, married to a coachman, death of a child led her to alcoholism and separation. And this is, I always find a quite fascinating anecdote. Seen talking to a shabby genteel chap in a deerstalker hat at 5:30 a.m. and her body was discovered at 6. So again, like the kind of the surreal nature of the Ripper murders, the deerstalker so closely associated with Sherlock Holmes, and finds its origin in this grim murder that happens. It's always the weird details in these stories that are so potent.
Yeah, there has to be somewhere out there an original story, because doesn't a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stories, weren't they set around this general time?
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be a Sherlock Holmes investigating Jack the Ripper. I mean,
Oh yeah, and there's a very famous graphic novel crossover as well.
oh yeah,
So
what's
yeah.
that called?
Oh,
Let's see. Murder by Decree. Well, that was the one that's the royal conspiracy theory.
or maybe there wasn't one that he actually wrote. But I think that what's interesting is if you go back and read the Conan Doyle stories, he definitely falls into that category of real life West End slummers. The people like Walter Sickert, who I'm sure we'll get onto, who would don sort of costumes of shabby coats and affect a mock Cockney accent, and wander the streets of the East End in a kind of voyeuristic sort of reverie, except that Sherlock Holmes uses these people for clues, and as the homeless urchins of London are used as his runners and riders, aren't they? Which is appalling.
And he always pays them for it.
Yeah, but that's so fine. We'll just leave you in poverty, and I'll just bung you 10 bob every time like the efficiency of my detective work relies on a bunch of homeless people existing in London at any one time. As one of the things I found most bizarre about the modern BBC adaptation, that they didn't find this slightly queasy. But
well, there's lots of things wrong with that. So,
yeah,
which we've discussed in a separate podcast.
Indeedy.
So anyway, on to so yeah, again we have a very similar background, which I'll just throw speculation out there right now. So again, assuming there was a serial killer working, he definitely had a victim type. These middle-aged women who were not, attractive per se. They were not, I mean, like when we hear prostitute, we think about someone who's a professional prostitute, if you will, who's getting dolled up to look a certain way, like the way it would have been portrayed in the From Hell movie. But these were women who, like, they tried to get honest work when they could. And this was something that, like if they were like on a tear or something, they, would go out and just, pick up some guy on the street, for drink money or for, their rent money or whatever. So it was just, it wasn't what they did exclusively. I feel like I really need to defend these women.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way too? Like I just see them as being such victims of circumstance and the culture they were in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So anyway, she's discovered by H Division, and an inquest is called. It's immediately linked to the other murder, so it's seen as her being a victim of the Ripper. I'm just reading now actually the notes from the police surgeon, and
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's horrific. I mean, they're doing the post-mortem when she hasn't even had rigor mortis set in, so the body's quite literally not cold yet.
Oh, this is the one that's now a parking garage, by the way.
Oh, is this White's Row?
Yeah.
But no, White's Row's not on Hanbury Street though.
Oh,
White's
which one?
Row.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a picture of it
Yeah.
that it's now a parking area. Well, I
It
think
might
a
be a
lot of
different
them,
parking garage.
they're all or car park as you call them. But yeah, so it's a lot of them are now parking garages. But as early or as recent as the 1960s, it still looked very much the same way. If you go to the Wikipedia page on Annie Chapman, it's still this very grim, creepy looking, disheveled backyard where you can
Absolutely.
imagine finding a body very easily. There's
So
like
this.
I was going to say like a dog wandering around. There's like a hole in the ground. It's really creepy.
Well, there's a reason why even in the 60s, the Bangladeshi first generation immigrants could go and get lodgings there. I mean, it's so close to the city, but it was hugely cheap because it was still in a very Tower Hamlets remains, which is the borough in which this sits, Whitechapel, remains one of the poorest boroughs in England and one of the poorest in Europe. So that hasn't changed a great deal. So. But anyway, this poor woman was brutally murdered. Her throat was cut from left to right. She'd been disemboweled, her intestines thrown out of her abdomen over each of her shoulders. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the uterus was missing. And, the idea is that she was asphyxiated before she was cut, thank goodness, because her tongue was sticking out.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this is the first murder where the police surgeon says the way in which the disemboweling was done would be consistent with someone having surgical skill. So that's where we start to have the theory that it could be a doctor or a barber, because in those days barbers were basically surgeons.
Mm-hmm.
And that obviously is setting up the possibility of the royal conspiracy, I would say.
Yeah. Also the mad medical student theory. So it seems like whoever did this was trying to get at something. They were trying to get at the essence of this woman, but like the way that just the intestines were thrown out. I'm like, we'll just sort of do the crime scene, like theorizing around this. That they were trying. This is the way I interpret it. That this murderer was trying to get at something.
Indeed. And so maybe this is a good time to discuss Tumblety.
I kind of like to leave that towards the end.
Okay, but okay. So guys, remember the name Tumblety. Tumblety,
Mm-hmm.
Tumblety, Tumblety.
It's such a great name.
It's such a great name.
Now here, I'm gonna inject a bit of doubt here, because the thing is, the uterus was missing, and it was noted in the autopsy that, well, everything else had just been, this absolute mess, absolute just brutal mess that had been done to her, that it appeared that the uterus had been removed fairly neatly and cleanly. With like someone knew what they were doing. So one could argue that what the thing that this person was trying to get at was the uterus, and once they reached their object of fixation, that then they would take their time, because this was the trophy. And this is something that serial killers do. They take trophies, whether it's something physical from the victim, or like a personal effect, or something from the crime scene that they're going to keep as like a totem. So there's that argument. But also one that was brought forth in a book I read by a former Scotland Yard investigator called Jack the Ripper, the 21st Century Investigation. His argument was that Annie's body was actually left unattended for a long period of time after it was taken in for the autopsy.
Oh,
and
okay.
he said that at this time that it was, there was a lot, I mean, like, this was a time of great societal change and advancements in science and technology, but there were still a lot of cultural mores and taboos in place that were creating impediments to these advancements. And so people getting a hold of, for example, medical specimens was still a big challenge. It isn't
Ah, of
today.
course. Yeah, yeah.
So his theory was that during this time period that the body was left unattended, some employee there within the police force took the uterus and sold it to a medical student or a doctor who needed it for their own work.
Which is very plausible. I mean, isn't this the time in Edinburgh when you've got those famous two
Burke
killers?
and Hare?
Exactly, Burke and
Yeah.
Hare, who were similarly trying to. They started off innocently, digging up buried bodies, freshly buried bodies, to sell for anatomy class, and then started manufacturing the bodies.
Which,
You know,
by
but
the way, if anyone has ever seen photos online of graves that are covered in like grates or cages, and it's like, oh, those are for anti-vampires. It's like, no, that was actually anti-grave robbing, because it was such a problem for a long time that people would dig up bodies and reuse them for medical study.
absolutely. And the whole kind of concept of manufacturing bodies is a huge. I mean, not just in terms of grave robbing. One of the key stories in Our Mutual Friend by Dickens is that the gaffer he's the kind of guy his job is to row a boat on the Thames at night and dredge up any dead bodies that have fallen in and sort of claim the belongings of them, and has Gaffer Hexam sort of created bodies to do this, and yeah, I mean, it's a huge societal. People would have been very aware of this, I think, as an issue at the time. So
Yeah.
I
So
guess.
I think that's a plausible theory, because there was another victim, we'll get to them, who also had some organs removed in this quote unquote surgical fashion. And it just, because it didn't become a consistent feature throughout the murders, and it just, to me, I feel like the whole mad medical student thing, it's just, it does, it's not, my theory of the person feverishly trying to get to their object of desire. um, Okay, I'm out of steam. You go.
No, I think it's something I haven't really considered before, but it makes a lot of sense. And I do love the idea of historical accident and people who are unconcerned with the actual murder doing stuff that upsets the evidence, and then whole bodies of conspiracy are built up over them. I like the idea. I mean, it would fit well with my concept of how these conspiracies begin, to be sure.
Oh yeah. And it's something to really keep in mind when considering a case like Jack the Ripper, because even though we have the documentation, we have the investigation, we have photos and things like that, that again, it was this crossroads time period of advancements, but also just sloppiness,
Yeah.
sloppy stuff that would never have passed muster, even with all the mistakes and bigotry that we see in modern police work today. The sheer amount of evidence that was destroyed or not properly processed. I mean, and we're not even talking about, well, they didn't have DNA and fingerprinting. Just the sheer amount of stuff that was destroyed purposely, like the chalk marking on one of the walls,
Mm,
for example, that they were like, well, let's rub this out because we don't want to. They were trying to avoid a pogrom. But
absolutely.
at the same time, it's like, guys, you had a clue right there, and yeah, okay.
You see, that I don't mind as much, because that was purposeful, and there was a very good reason behind it. But we'll get to the Ripper letters later, and so many pieces of evidence have just been lost because at the end of the case, people decided to just nick them and keep them as a personal memento, or sell them on the black market, and then 50 years later they turn up again at auction. And I mean, the chain of evidence concept is completely non-existent at this point.
Hmm.
But anyway, let's. I tend to think it's far more incompetence than malice, though, on the part of the Metropolitan Police at this point. So we now turn to the double event, which
Hmm.
occurred on the night of 27th of November. Sorry, I'm getting that wrong. On the night of the 30th of September 1888, where we have both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes killed. So if we start with Elizabeth Stride, Long Liz. So
Hmm.
she's interesting because she's actually Swedish, and she had been a registered prostitute in Sweden. She had lost a baby, stillbirth, because of venereal disease, and had then made the decision to come to London and had ended up a prostitute in London as well. Although she was, she was still nominally married to someone, so it's she was separated and therefore, I guess, beyond his protection. So again, it's a very weird one because she doesn't have a lot of the classic mutilation, but the theory is that this was an interrupted
Yes.
murder, and therefore you then have the serial killer who has failed to satiate his need to rip, and therefore less than an hour later, as this murder is still being investigated, I mean, I've done this walk actually, it's about a 9-minute walk. You then have the murder in Mitre Square of Catherine Eddowes to satisfy that. So yeah, she in a way gets away with a less disgusting mutilation. Of course, not a nice way to go.
Yeah, I think that makes sense actually because it was interrupted by a man who was actually starting he was either coming home from his work day or starting it, which again is a testament to the 24-hour slash nocturnal nature of the Whitechapel district and why there were not more witnesses. Mm.
It's true, actually. I mean, it's worth saying that this area of London, even today, or London all around, because it has the great markets that still exist. So I always used to remember that I used to work just across, not from Spitalfields Market, which is where the Whitechapel murders happened, but the Smithfield markets, and we would be walking to work at 7 in the morning through the
Hmm.
city, and you'd have all these pubs. So Smithfield Market is where all the meat is sold.
Hmm.
And you'd have all these guys in butchers' aprons having got up at midnight to do the full day's wholesale market work. And for them, 7 in the morning was dinner time, so all the pubs in that area were open and serving a pie and a pint because they were having their dinner and heading home. So this concept that even in very modern, uber modern London, it's a 24-hour city and there's always someone finishing, someone starting. There's never peace. And again, why weren't more murders interrupted when you realise that? But yeah. Oh, I love this area of London so much.
Well, London is definitely on my list of places I want to visit, and I mean, we have a few friends and family who were there, so we would have enough reason to go. Um, but I definitely want to check out. Like, I would love to do one of the Ripper tours for sure.
Oh, we'll definitely we'll do a moot. We'll do a Rippertor
Oh
moot.
yes, yes. Oh my God, let's do
Let's
it.
make it let's make it happen.
Mhm.
Okay. Anyway, so
Yeah.
gosh, back
Uh,
to poor Elizabeth Stride as we plan our holidays. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's much we want to say. I'm reading through the case notes, seeing if there's anything specific to mention.
yeah, well, I think the important thing to note about Elizabeth Stride is that it was yeah, an interrupted murder, that she had been killed. It was in, because a lot of these murders happen in sort of like enclosed yards
Mm.
that were like in between a lot of you might be able to hear my son right now. He's just
Aw.
infiltrated. Hey buddy. Hey buddy, mama's talking about murder.
How old is
Yeah.
he? How old is
He's a
he?
year and a half.
Oh, so
So
cute.
so he walks, he babbles.
Yay.
Mhm. Nah. Did you hear that?
He's not down with the mad doctor or the theory. One day I feel that we should get like Nadia's little girl, your son, Shane's kids, and just let them like babble. The children of Vok.
That would be great.
And just let them, maybe in like 5 years or something, if this is still going, and just say,
Mhm.
yeah, it was really annoying when I was a kid. I was always told to shush by my mum when she was talking about, like gruesome murder.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Um, yeah, so yeah, my husband just took him out. He's going to take him for a walk around our apartment complex, I think. Um, so we have these sort of like little yards, which were like they were like communal but not. And one thing I noted with a lot of these case files was how a lot of people didn't lock their doors. And the
Mm.
fact that they said, well, we didn't lock our door shows that they had the capacity to do so, but they didn't. Excuse me. Oh, that was gross. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but people didn't. I mean, I remember when we sold my childhood home when I was 18, and we just literally couldn't find the front door key because we'd never locked the front door. It was a different time, I think.
yeah, and So, and people would come in through these alleys in between the houses and into these yards, and prostitutes would use them with their clients. So it makes sense to me that a lot of these victims were picked up as, um, they were hired. A client showed that they had money, or just was like, hey, let's go over here, and that they went willingly, which is, I think, something that is one of the few things that can be agreed on by Ripper researchers, is that these victims did go willingly.
Yes, exactly. But also bear in mind when we get to these murders, the concept of Jack the Ripper killing prostitutes in Whitechapel is very well known and publicized. And whether or not it came from the Ripper, you've had the Saucy Jack postcard talking about a double event. So these women, I mean, how desperate do you have to be to still ply the streets for your trade, knowing that this is a possibility, going in the grimmest, smoggiest, there was no public lighting in this part of London, then going into a dark alley, into a deserted courtyard.
Yeah, with a stranger.
Oh, I mean, the desperation for those few pence and the inebriation from cheap gin. It's absolutely heartbreaking because, unlike the first victims, these victims knew the threat and still went out onto the streets at
Yeah,
5 in the
because
morning.
yeah, it was a big story at the time. I mean, it wasn't like people didn't
Huge.
know what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Mary Kelly's murder, besides the whole damn thing, is that apparently, well, she was illiterate, so she was having her boyfriend read her the accounts of the murders from the newspapers because she wanted to keep herself safe.
I know. Oh,
Yeah,
poor Mary
and
Kelly.
yeah, um,
Okay. But anyway,
no,
so the murder is interrupted,
mhm.
and the Ripper presumably moves what is a 5-minute walk away to within the boundaries of the City of London to Mitre Square, which is still, it's a beautiful square actually, incredibly well kept because it's on the city side, not the Whitechapel side of the boundary. And it has, big glossy, it's the heart of the insurance district, so you've got major insurance firms there on that address. It's amazing to me that, that people still, despite those associations, will be there. And she is murdered, poor Catherine Eddowes, while the police are on the scene
Yeah.
at the other place, which is appalling and horrible to me.
And I think this is a good point to interject the fact that most people only talk about the handful of so-called Ripper letters. According to one of the books I read, there were actually dozens, if not hundreds of them sent. And how this handful got sort of christened as authentic is unclear. But the thing is that it's now that pretty much all of them are now considered to be inauthentic, except for maybe the actual From Hell letter.
Yeah.
But that there was a letter sent to, it was either the head of sort of the neighborhood watch, because he got some of the letters, but another one was to a newspaper, like the Central News Agency.
Yes.
And that was warning of double event next time. And then, lo and behold, we have these two murders within minutes of each other.
And it's almost guaranteed that he can't have known that he would be interrupted and do it. That to me guarantees it wasn't from the Ripper, because the whole concept of the double event is an interrupted murder, and then it wasn't by design. I can't believe
Correct.
it was by design. It would have been a patient mutilation of both victims if that were the case. So, yeah. It's awful actually. I'm on the Wikipedia page and I'm just seeing the pictures of Catherine Eddowes for whatever bizarre reason they've chosen to show her full body stitched up in the middle post-mortem. But the tragedy of the Catherine Eddowes one for me is that she had been taken into custody by the Bishopsgate police, which is the main thoroughfare in the city that's parallel to the commercial road, which is in Whitechapel. So they're kind of the city and Whitechapel mirror images, but literally connected by all these dodgy, dark alleys. And had been kicked out at 1 a.m. because she was sober enough to leave, and literally kicked out to her death. She goes through the church passage into Mitre Square, which, by the way, is policed, not only by a policeman, but also by a night watchman. And I think nothing tells you more about the smog and the darkness and the impenetrability of those streets than the fact that neither of them noticed what was happening.
Yeah. It is truly mind-boggling.
Mm.
that within these close quarters and these okay, yeah, like yeah, it was hard to see, but like the fact that he got so good at incapacitating his victims, because it's something that you've already mentioned, that the theory is that he strangled them either to death or into unconsciousness before starting the worst part of what he did. And the fact that he got so good at this and was so fast at it is just, yeah, I mean, the more I think about it, the more it's like, okay, when you look at all the circumstantial evidence, the idea of it being more than one guy who really wanted to do this,
Yeah.
I mean, we've already talked about the couple murders that probably weren't his, that were just different enough. Um,
Mm.
but now that we're into the canonical five, it's like, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, if
Uh,
you read, she's being ripped from navel to neck. She's had her
yeah.
intestines removed, thrown over the shoulder, which is the classic sign. He's cut out a piece, put it very design by design, sort of by her arm. The lobe has been clipped, which is another classic Ripper sort of thing. But again, the fact that the police are investigating another murder just to, 5 minutes away, he's kind of patiently doing this. I mean, all this stuff takes time, even in a frenzy. And then when they discover the body, it's still warm. So I think what to me makes the Ripper maybe so potent as myth, one of the many things, is that his presence, the audacity of it, the fact that his presence was there just around the corner from where the police were.
Hmm.
In other words, the fact that we're so not safe.
Yeah,
Um,
and this would have been like this is like the ultimate serial killer wet dream too. By the way, the idea that he's doing he just did one murder and is now doing another with the police, just yards away, and they don't even know. Like every serial killer probably dreams of this.
oh, really? Okay, so
Uh,
that's something that's going to get
Yeah.
him off even more. So
Oh
maybe he
yeah.
did. So maybe he did dream of pulling off an audacious double murder, and I'm wrong to dismiss that letter then.
Yeah. But it's so hard to say. There's so many different ways to interpret it.
So police physician Thomas Bond disagreed with the mortician Brown's assessment of the killer's skill level. In each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. He does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer. So a lot of disagreement even at the time about whether this person needs to be a barber or a surgeon. So
Yes, so this really muddies the waters in terms of, is it one person? Is it, and then also the other theory that was put forward about how the organs might have been removed post-mortem to be sold on the black market.
mm. Which is I'm coming to believe that is the case.
Hmm.
And after this, we get the From Hell letter, but let's save that a little bit until we do all the letters
Hmm.
and just maybe finish off with our final victim, who is poor Mary Jane Kelly, who was killed on the 9th of November 1888. So let me just repeat the dates of these murders. The canonical murders: 30th of August, 8th of September, 30th of September, 30th of September, 9th of November, which leads me to believe that there would have been victims in October that we just don't know about.
Hmm.
So a small moment for her. Mary Jane Kelly, Irish but raised in Wales. She married a coal miner. He died in an explosion and she was forced into prostitution. So again, the idea that mere widowhood could put you so far down, so on the breadline that you were forced into prostitution. There's an interesting story about her that she may, at the time, there was a white slave trade whereby women were kidnapped, a little bit similar to how today you might have poor girls in sort of Russia or Eastern Europe who are
Hmm.
lured with a promise of coming to England on a passport and then end up basically locked in a horrible room, may well be in Whitechapel and pimped out. She had the same experience where she was taken to France on great promises by a man who promised he would take care of her, find clothes, perfume, and ended up being pimped out
Hmm.
in France and managed to get out. Gets to London, falls back into prostitution, and is brutally killed in 13 Miller's Court on Lord Mayor's Parade Day. Now, Lord Mayor's Parade Day, so we have the Mayor of London, who's the Mayor of the whole of London
Hmm.
today, but then you have the Mayor of the City of London, so just a little bit. So Dick Whittington was the Lord Mayor of London. And to this day, on the 9th of November, or that weekend, you have a Lord Mayor's Parade. And I cannot describe to you how many people are in the City of London for that parade, how chaotic it is. You have all the ancient guilds come out, so the cordwainers and the fabric winders and the weavers and the jewellery makers come out and have a big parade and all their guild finery. The police are out, you have all the businessmen out on parade. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And the concept that just 2 minutes behind the main parade route on 13 Miller's Court, because it literally is like one house away from that main parade route, this leisurely murder is happening in a private room. In a room, not even in a yard. 2 hours he took. It's appalling to me. And as I said, that is the site that now is a Corporation of London car park. So if you want to see pictures today, literally this week, of what that site looks like, if you go onto the podcast of Ice and Fire forum and onto the thread for this podcast, then you can see the pictures, as well as Hanbury Street and some others that I took. So yeah, this is the one I find the worst, actually. It really is.
Oh, I don't think there's any way it could be found the worst. I mean, it's just... I kind of wonder if this is what the Ripper wanted to do to his victims all along, but this was the only chance he had to do it to the fullest.
Yeah, this is the one where he was undisturbed. The Lord Mayor's Parade was happening. He had 2 hours and he could really... This, I think, is the fullest expression of the Ripper. This is what he was building to. And obviously the last one, so obviously then there's the question of why did he stop? Did he commit suicide? Was he incarcerated? Was he murdered? What happened at the end? But
or were there more murders?
Were there more murders that we don't know about off screen, of course. But surely, I mean, you know more about this than me probably, but isn't it in the nature of the serial killer that by this point, this full expression, would this have been satiating? Would he have... Can you stop? No. You drive yourself on to death, I guess, or... somebody stops you.
I think that it's generally accepted that serial killers generally will not stop until they die or they are caught. Or or they feel themselves close to detection and therefore stop for a while.
Okay.
However, there is the theory that he completed what he set out to do, so to speak, and that he was able to stop and maybe kill himself afterwards. But I feel that's more romantic than anything else. So I think it's just... So the way the serial killer mind works, with this very elaborate murder fantasy, is he got to do it once. Well, that means he'd have to do it again. It wouldn't have been enough.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think we can definitely agree that, again, going back to the original premise of if there was a Jack the Ripper, if there was just one serial killer, that this was the fullest expression of what he wanted to do.
So I'm gonna go ahead and just read something from the post-mortem notes, because I think it is horrific, but I think it shows you the progression. So. And the time taken, the leisureliness of the time taken in a house where other people were at the time. So bear that in mind. Bear that in mind. The whole surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. So it's not just clipping a lobe. The tissues of the neck were severed all round down to the bone. The viscera were found in various parts, viz. The uterus and kidneys, with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on a table. So the kind of the leisurely arrangement of parts, it's like it's a fetishized killing, and it's almost like a ceremonial killing. And I think From Hell obviously isn't how it happened, but the idea of someone in a kind of almost religious reverie, it's very sort of like a theatrical performance of an arrangement of parts. It's somehow it's horrific. And then I won't read out the whole thing because it's horrific, but the bed clothing at the right corner was saturated with blood, and the floor beneath was a pool of blood covering about 2 feet square. So this wasn't like the earlier murders. The sheer The earlier murders, even if there was ripping, it wasn't until you re-lifted up the dresses or undid the bodice that you realised how much damage was done. This
Hmm.
is an absolute massacre of an individual, and just unbelievable. And I would strongly urge you guys, if you're listening to this and you think you want to go to the Wikipedia page of this thing, just don't read the full
Don't.
details. Just
Don't.
don't, because number
Don't
one,
look at the picture.
don't look at the pictures. Don't do it when you've got kids in the room. And I've read to you about 2% of what is the post-mortem report. It's absolutely horrific.
Hmm. This is the complete destruction of a human being.
Yeah, and the viciousness, the absolute viciousness. And that to me is like when Patricia Cornwell, the author for whom I have respect as an author, argues that this could be Walter Sickert and that an artist could have done this because of some fetishized problem with women and then have gone and painted pictures of it and gone on to France. This is not the extremity of what happened in this murder is not something I believe that you then go back to a normal life afterwards. And is it Tumblety, one of the suspects, people think, oh, then he goes to America and starts, gassing people or something. Like,
Yeah.
I don't see how you step back from this.
Yeah, no,
So
this is you're not a human being after you do this to a person.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, and yeah, interesting from our own podcast device in Fireface. I really do wonder how far. I'll cut this out because it's spoilerish for Winds of Winter, but how far they'll let Arya go along this ground.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. We won't get completely into that at all.
Yeah. So, anything
Um,
else to say about poor Mary Jane Kelly before we move to the investigation and suspects?
well, it's a very notable murder for a number of reasons. One, it's the only one that happened indoors. Two, it's the only one where with this extreme level of mutilation, as extreme as the other mutilations were before. Three, there is another possible suspect, um,
Who's the other
and
possible suspect?
her boyfriend at the time.
Really?
Yeah, because she had gone back to prostitution, and he was really mad about it.
Yeah, but there's mad and there's a stabbing through madness, and then there's
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just think it's just good to throw that out there, just because, I mean, the fact of the matter is that if a person's going to be murdered, chances are they're going to be murdered by someone they know. That's just the way it works.
True, very true. Domestic
Yeah.
violence,
Hmm.
definitely.
But again, a murder out of like what do they call it? Crime of passion. Yeah, it would have been more likely that they would have been fighting. The boyfriend would have struck a fatal blow to her, and then as soon as she fell down dead, he would have been like, "Oh my God, what did I do?"
Yeah,
So
he wouldn't have carefully arranged her organs around her
no,
head.
he wouldn't have done anything to her organs. But I just think that it's important to note that she was having a dispute with her boyfriend at the time, because a modern day police investigation, as they did at the time, the Bartnett was her boyfriend, would have definitely looked at him.
Yeah.
And then another question is, how did the Ripper find her? She was inside her room. What did she pick him up? Because there's some evidence to suggest another woman in the boarding house did hear Mary throughout the night, that she might have brought him in, and then he would have rendered her unconscious and then begun what he did, or just like the sheer amount of insecurity, that someone could have just like seen her through the window and then like reached through a broken window to open the door.
I think that's probably what it was. I think it's a crime of opportunity. I mean,
Yeah.
these little alleyways and yards aren't big. I mean, they're perfectly visible from the street.
Hmm.
And in these dark, gloomy nights, if you have a candle on inside or an electric light on inside, I think it's perfectly possible. It really is. I mean, the streets, particularly where this particular murder is, so it's right, as I said, between those two main thoroughfares of the Commercial Street and Bishopsgate. And even today, they haven't managed with some clearance to straighten those little tiny alleyways out. And they're tiny. They're basically maybe a foot and a half wide between the buildings, and you can literally almost reach from one to the other with your hand. And I think it would be utterly possible for this to be a crime of opportunity. And it's one of those things that just being in that environment, you could see how easily it could happen. It seems bizarre to read about it, but I think
Hmm.
it's very much the case
Yeah,
that it be possible.
since you've actually been there, you can say no, it could have happened.
Yeah,
Um,
it really could. And yeah, it's amazing.
yeah. So I want to just give you like half-hour warning. We have to go soon to the airport to pick up my father-in-law. So I think I don't want to rush things here, but we're going to have to start moving on to oh boy, we got a lot left.
Well, there's suspects and letters, but we can do a second podcast with FT Ward.
Oh yeah, for
Which
sure.
is also possible. So, what would you prefer to talk about? We could do the letters, or we could do the suspects, or we could do popular culture. I
I
mean,
think we should do the letters and then save the rest for the next time.
part two. Super.
Yes.
Okie dokie. So, there are a number of letters as we've alluded to.
Hmm.
We'll go through them in order. So the first one is the Dear Boss letter, which was postmarked and received on the 27th of September, sent to the Central News Agency and forwarded to Scotland Yard on September 29th. Why do you keep it 2 days? People think it is probably authentic. It was lost and only recovered in 1988. How does that happen? Chain of evidence, people.
Yeah. Well, also 1988, the 100-year anniversary. So I don't know.
So do you think it's authentic?
I feel like the fact that it was recovered on the 100th anniversary, like in time for all that, is suspicious to me.
Well, I think the one that was brought forward and recovered probably might have been a fake, but the original one that was noted down and the words noted, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely
okay.
existed. So the question
all right.
is, the question is,
Was it
kind
authentic
of,
at the time?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And it's the letter that gives the name to Jack the Ripper because it was signed Jack the Ripper. But you see, what convinces me is, and maybe it's just a very good, it's just the language, the way the language is done. So, Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Great work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. And it goes on and on, but there's something maliciously nasty about it that feels right, but then maybe that's just good fiction, honestly. I don't know.
To me, it feels like this is a reporter's attempt to be like, well, what would this guy say, knowing the facts?
And the fact that he gave himself the journalistic, the wonderful Jack the Ripper title, I guess. Okay, so then we go on to Saucy Jack, which is in the great tradition of British seaside postcards that have saucy pictures on the front. The Saucy Jack postcard mentions the double event. It was postmarked 24 hours after it, so... And it was lost. I think that's probably dodgy. I don't think that's real. We can dismiss that quite quickly. The famous one is the From Hell letter, postmarked on 15th of October 1888, received by George Lusk, who was then head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee the following day. This is the one, because the spelling and everything is so bad, I think might be right. From hell, Mr. Lusk saw I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you t'other piece. I fried and ate it, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that it took out, if you only wait a while longer. Sign catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. He doesn't sign it Jack the Ripper. He doesn't sign it with any dodgy name. The spelling's appalling. Yeah.
I feel like the spelling errors definitely show a lack. And they're not the kind of spelling errors that you can make up on the fly. This is someone. Well, they're kind of speaking with an okay.
I mean, I even put on an accent saying it because it forces you to speak with an accent in a way.
Yeah, like that Cockney accent. Well, okay, so like on one hand, it sort of gives credence to the idea that this was an uneducated person who, at the very least, could do some writing, and therefore was writing phonetically. Which, I mean, you'll see this in people who just are not native speakers of any language, be it English or whatever.
Yeah. Which, per my theory that he was a Polish Jew and they covered up because they didn't want to incite, that would fit in very well.
So he's writing with an accent. But on the other hand, you could see that it's a cynical attempt to incriminate someone in the lower classes or the immigrant community. So you can look at it from either angle.
Absolutely, very tricksy. But that's the one that was... the From Hell letter is the one that typically is seen as being real. It's also the one that was lost, I guess. So then we have the Goulston Street graffiti, which is in the
Mm-hmm.
letter. It's graffiti, I know. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Random anti-Semitism refers to Masonry, as From Hell suggests, the three J starting gods of Masonry. French spelling for Jews. Charles Warren ordered it washed away. I think this might just be random anti-Semitism.
Yeah, this was found after
It was
which
found before the double event, so after
Catherine Eddowes. And
no,
wasn't
before the double event, I think.
okay. But wasn't part of one of the victims' like aprons or part of her dress found near this scene
Yeah,
that had been cut
absolutely.
away, and apparently the murderer had possibly wiped his hands on
Mm.
it. Um,
So wiping hands, hence the blame. Won't be blamed for nothing.
mhm.
But the double negative, not helpful.
Yeah, it's like, what are you trying to say here, dude?
Like, spell it
Oh,
out and spell it
yeah.
properly.
Hmm.
Jews, Jewes. What are you
Hmm.
saying here? I think it was probably someone seeing that the Jews were getting blamed, either concurring that they should be blamed with the double negative, or saying, "Of course we're going to get blamed, but it's not us." It strikes me as a mob comment rather than actual evidence. And the final letter, well, not the final letter. There were millions, thousands of
Hmm.
letters. The Openshaw Letter, October the 22nd, 1888. Old boss, you was right. It was the left kidney I was going to operate again, close to your hospital. Just as I was going to draw my knife along of a blooming throat, them cusses of coppers spoilt the game. But I guess I will be on the job soon, and we'll send you another bit of innards. Jack the Ripper. Oh, have you seen the devil with his microscope and scalpel looking at a kidney with a slide cocked up? So I read that incompetently because it's hard to read stuff that isn't spelt right.
This one does not feel right to me at all.
Because he signs it Jack the Ripper.
Well, okay, so here's
And
the thing.
the microscope. I mean, come
Hmm.
on.
Well, I think it's important to note that the From Hell letter was sent with part of a human kidney.
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have. It's so funny. Like some of the details in the Ripper murder are so like common to all of us. Like I just assume
Hmm.
everyone knows it, right? So.
Yeah. Oh no, for me too. Like as I was doing my research for the podcast, I was like, yeah, okay, I know. Get to something I don't already know about.
Yeah, exactly. Because the actual facts are scant.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think the key point about the Openshaw letter is that if you think it's hokey, this is the letter that Patricia Cornwell famously did a DNA test on.
Hmm. Yeah, she's the crime
And
writer.
she's the crime writer and said, "Oh, it's Walter Sickert because he shares the mtDNA with the
Hmm.
writer of this letter." And of course, mtDNA is mitochondrial DNA. It's
Hmm.
very common and doesn't prove anything, especially if the letters are fake anyway.
Hmm.
So I think my conclusion is probably that all the letters are fake, apart from maybe the From Hell one. Just because Aberline wasn't a complete idiot, and if he thought it was real, I kind of. Why would someone get a human kidney, and do that though? Like
Yeah.
sending the body part, that's effort for a journalist.
Yeah, it doesn't. I agree that it's the only one that seems remotely plausible. Because I mean, again, like their investigative capacity was not nowhere near what we have today, obviously, but they were fairly sure it was a human kidney,
Mm.
and it wasn't even a whole one because part of the letter also claimed cannibalism.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, but it's not uncommon in situations like this.
But as if the mutilation isn't enough, we need to
Hmm.
sensationalize it even more.
Hmm.
It's almost disrespectful to the injuries these girls suffered. Like
Hmm.
that's not enough.
Hmm. Well, that's the goal of a serial killer, is to completely remove the humanity of their victims. Well, that's one
So,
of the goals.
okay, so do you think cannibalism is kind of fairly common then, or some?
Um, I think in the case of serial killers, it can be. Um, I think there's been a number of more modern serial killers that have at least tried it.
Mm.
I mean, I feel like I'm like the de facto cannibalism expert because I'm so heavily into the Hannibal fandom. Um, but
Yes.
let's just say that it's something that has been present in enough modern um, serial killer cases to be considered plausible in this case.
Okay. Now, I don't know how long you have left, but maybe a smaller topic we can do discreetly before the next part of this podcast where we do suspects is the police handling of the case. Because you were the one, I think, who put on the forums that this was a massively sort of... I'd always just assumed the police had done their best with limited resources and techniques at the time, but you were saying that no, it was appallingly handled.
Yeah, I have time to talk about that, sure. I just feel that okay, like good on them for identifying that something was really wrong, more wrong than usual in Whitechapel. But
yeah,
I just, as I was doing my reading, I got the impression that the police themselves were far too overtaken by the general hysteria that was going on, and that they didn't go about things as soberly as they could have. And yeah, they were under pressure to catch the criminal, but maybe this is just me looking at this with a modern eye, that we would not have, a modern investigator would not have moved the bodies, for example. The standard procedure at the time was, found a body, immediately put it in a hand cart and take it somewhere.
Yeah. I agree. But I think that, one forgets that this was it was a very modern thing, the police. I mean, when was the police founded? Like, seriously, by Robert Peel? I mean, it's the 1850s before we have Bobbies on the Beat. This is 1888, so it's 38 years old, more or less. You still have people being appointed who aren't really policemen. I mean, George Aberline or Frederick Aberline was a clockmaker. It wasn't a profession in the way that it is today.
Yeah.
And it's almost like an extension of the civil service. If you look at the senior appointees like Sir Charles Warren and Robert Anderson, they're very politicized appointments.
Yes.
And in a way, their job wasn't really to keep the streets free of crime. It was to stop evil Irish Catholic terrorists who wanted home rule for Ireland blowing up people in central London. It was almost more of a sort of an anti-terrorism squad than keeping the peace. I mean, domestic violence at this point, women were the chattel of their husbands. It wasn't a crime to rape your wife. It wasn't a crime to beat her. So why would a woman crying out for help be seen as anything that the police should get involved with in a way? So I think in a sense they were curiously unfitted for the task. The only thing I think you can charge them with is being utterly riddled with Masons. And not that I have anything against the Masonic tradition, but for the conspiracy theorists, it doesn't help.
Yeah.
It really doesn't help that the police are so have had at that time, at least in the upper echelon, such a high proportion who were Masons. But yeah.
So do we want to then just talk quickly about the police and then leave off there?
Absolutely. So I guess the names people know are probably Aberline, Warren, and Anderson, and maybe the Home Secretary Henry Matthews. So if we start in reverse order of seniority, I guess the guy actually treading the floor is Aberline. He's the guy on the pavements. As I said, a former clockmaker turned detective who investigated both the Ripper investigation and the Cleveland Street scandal, so famously the homosexual brothel in the East End where one of Queen Victoria's sons was found complicit. And then ended up being the head of Europe's Pinkerton operation. So, clearly intelligent. But we'll get on to him because he thought it was Kosminski, and I have a lot of respect for Aberline, which is why I kind of think it probably was Kosminski too. But any comments on him?
Not really, other than he probably was more competent than some. The Cleveland Street, I mean, I think it's important to just quickly note that the sheer amount of debauchery that occurred during the Victorian era. And, this we'll get into next time with looking at the suspects and, could a homosexual man have been responsible for these murders, like Tumblety, because we don't want to forget him. He's one of my favorites for hometown hero.
Yay.
Yeah, well, I mean, heroes.
Tumblety,
when
tumblety, tumblety. Great
when
name.
you come from a little shit town like I do, you really grab onto anything you can. You
Even if it's a
know,
purported serial killer. I love it.
yeah, it's like, hey, Jack the Ripper might have come from my hometown, but actually, my Rochester has had a number of blows recently. We had our first police officer die in the line of duty since like the 1950s the other day,
Oh my
killed in a
goodness.
shooting. And then I don't know if you heard, this was actually pretty big national news. There was a small prop plane that was flying in Florida,
Hmm.
and it suddenly stopped responding and crashed. It looked like it was heading towards Cuba, and it was discovered it was being piloted by a local Rochester businessman with his wife on board, and they're dead. But
Jeez.
it was like, what? What?
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
it's never the hometown connection you want. And of course, the departed and greatly mourned Philip Seymour Hoffman
Yay.
from Rochester
There
earlier
you
this
go.
year.
Poor kid.
So that tells you. And of course, Kodak is now was bankrupt, and they invented photography as we think of it, and
Hmm.
the founder freaking killed himself.
Really?
Yeah, George Eastman. Well, he had been diagnosed with some kind of horrible degenerative nerve disease. I don't know if it was Parkinson's or what he would have been diagnosed with today, but he decided to take matters into his own hands.
Just one
And
second, the phone's going. I'm just gonna.
okay, are you back?
Hello.
Yes, yes, I'm here.
Sorry. My mother
Um,
has this uncanny ability to ring whenever I'm podcasting.
um, so George Eastman, just to finish up that little sidetrack, he decided he didn't want to wait, and because apparently his mother had died of the same ailment, and he had seen her just, degenerate and seen her pain and suffering, and was just like, nope, I'm just gonna end it now. Um, so anyway, that's what it feels like to come from a town or city that just has like all this famous stuff that is bad. Um, so let's go back to the topic at hand and finish up with the main investigators, and then we'll pause and try to get FT Ward with us next time.
Absolutely. So you have Aberline, who's the guy on the street. You then have a bunch of interesting guys. There's Sir Charles Warren, General Sir Charles Warren, a
Hmm.
founding master of the Quator Coronati Masonic Lodge. Excellent.
Yeah.
He's an absolutely fascinating character. He was a complete nutter. He was a military general of some renown. He was the chief excavator of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He'd done extensive service all through the British Empire. He was the head of the Metropolitan Police during the Ripper murders. And he was absolutely pilloried in the press. He was the guy who had been appointed basically on the back of his anti-terrorism expertise, which in this era was anti-Catholic,
Hmm.
and there had been a great riot, an Irish riot called Bloody Sunday,
Hmm.
and he had been, because he's a military guy, he'd been seen parading in all his gold braid on his shoulders and had been pilloried in the press. He was very very much seen as a guy who was misappointed, the classic guy who's done well in one field is appointed to be head of the Met and fails completely. And I think it's true of the time that people who were in charge of the police weren't natural policemen because the police hadn't been going on long enough. So you had the kind of the working class professionals like Aberline who really knew their trade, and you have these people who are parachuted in to run the whole thing, who are basically sort of moronic, not moronic, that's unfair, but unqualified pros from the right class. And you see this throughout British society at the time. And then we have Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of Crime for Metropolitan Police, who went on sick leave to Switzerland almost as soon as he was appointed. So he was away throughout the investigation. But again, a former barrister, so a lawyer, an anti-terrorism expert. Because he's famous because he's commented on a lot of the papers. So when we come to the suspects, who Anderson thought did it and who Aberline thought did it conflict, and therefore you can trust the guy on the streets or the guy who was behind the desk.
Yeah, and you kind of have to wonder, just given the general confusion and yeah, just tumult of the time. Were these guys with their theories any better than we are now, 100 plus years later, in terms of being
Exactly.
able to speculate? Was what I mean, like we assume that since they were there, that they knew so much more, but it's like given how much documentation we do have, I do have to wonder: are we Were they making the same stabs in the dark? Ha! Oh God, that was horrible. Are they are they any better off than we are today?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So the only other person I want to mention, just because I'm a papist and about to do a Brideshead Revisited podcast, is so you've got the two guys running the Met, anti-Catholic. They're anti-Catholic terrorism experts. At this period in history, as up until very recently, you couldn't be Prime Minister of England if you were Catholic, and you certainly couldn't marry into the royal family. But
yeah, still can.
Actually, no, that's changed. It's literally changed.
Wait, for the royal family?
Yeah. I mean, it would have to be a morganatic marriage, right? So the kids can be Catholic, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
So they changed that when Prince William and Kate were pregnant, and they decided that if she had a daughter, she could inherit rather than the son. And then they decided to get rid of a few nefarious old things that had been, hanging.
I remember at the time they got married, it was just like, oh, and by the way, as future defender of the faith, she's definitely not Catholic.
Yeah, just in case you were worried about those evil papists.
As is tradition.
So the Home Secretary, who is the British minister who is in charge of domestic safety, so he'll be head of the police, head of prisons, policy, and the judiciary, so the Home Secretary, as we call him, was a Catholic, the first ever Catholic Home Secretary, Henry Matthews. And he resigned over the handling of the Ripper case. Now, he resigned. There were a couple of things going on. There were 3 or 4 things that contributed to this resignation. But it's worth bearing in mind that the Ripper case was so huge that the policing of it was so pioneering and so testing of the basically amateurish Metropolitan Police that a government minister resigned over the Ripper case. It's also worth noting that because of the Ripper case, we had lighting in the East End of London. It's also worth noting. So those roads today are lit with lights that were put in first on the back of this case. It's also worth noting that in the run-up to the Ripper case, there was a new journalist called W.T. Stead who wrote a pamphlet that was very campaigning about the conditions in the East End. And Queen Victoria herself asked her Prime Minister at the time to make an inquiry. And just ironic that when you realise her son was in one of the gay brothels that was in this area, taking part of the voyeuristic sleaze trade. So all sorts of great ironies. And the Ripper case reaches up to the very top of British society, and that's the one thing that From Hell gets right, I think, that it was from the poor prostitute who gets killed and gets her boyfriend to read her the reports, the illiterate girl, up to the Queen, everyone knew about it and read about it.
Yeah, it really did capture the public's attention for pretty much a full year, and it was reported around the world as well. I think that's important to note. So part 2, we will get F.T. Warden here. We will talk. We'll probably revisit some of these points that I'm sure that there's some stuff he wants to make some points about that we already talked about, but then we'll really get into the suspects.
We'll get into, well, yeah, exactly. We'll do the suspects in great detail. We'll also do the Ripper and popular culture, because I think that's really interesting and bears discussion.
You know what also makes me sad? It would have been nice if we could have gotten Kyle from the main podcast to read the letters in actual Cockney accent.
I was literally thinking of putting a post on the forums and saying, does anyone want to read out the Ripper letters? Thinking maybe Valkyris or someone would do it. But I thought, maybe it's just an odd thing to ask people. Maybe it just sounds like really sleazy and macabre.
Well, it is. I mean, like, because as you're reading them, you start to get, goosebumps on your arms. But it's like, because Kyle is our resident, like, actual professional actor, it's like, I just want to hear him take a crack at it. So maybe he can do that next time. We'll get some creepy music in the background. But
so thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you guys all enjoyed listening. There will be a part 2 to Rippercast, and
Rippercast.
Yay! And I apologise if it was rather gruesome, but hopefully we've shown that we come to this in earnest sympathy for the poor woman who died, and with interest of the time and the context. So it's goodbye from me, Bina 007.
And from me, No True Lady, and stay tuned for Tumble Tea.
Tumble tea, tumble tea, tumble tea.
All right, I gotta get going.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.